The winter wind howled across the Volga River, carrying with it the screams of dying men and the thunder of artillery that would never truly fade from this place. In the frozen ruins of a city that bore the Soviet leader's name, two empires collided with such ferocity that the very ground trembled beneath the weight of their hatred. This was Stalingrad, where the fate of nations hung in the balance, where every street became a graveyard, and where the course of human history turned on the courage of soldiers who fought not just for victory, but for survival itself. The story begins not in the rubble of a burning city, but in the mind of a man who believed himself invincible. Adolf Hitler stood before his maps in the summer of 1942, his finger tracing lines across the vast expanse of Soviet territory. His armies had already driven deep into the heart of Russia, crushing Soviet defenses and capturing millions of prisoners. The oil fields of the Caucasus lay tantalizingly close, their black gold promising to fuel the German war machine for years to come. But between Hitler and those precious resources stood a city on the Volga, an industrial center named after his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. The city's capture would sever Soviet supply lines, secure the German flank, and deliver a crushing psychological blow to Soviet morale. Hitler became obsessed with taking Stalingrad, not merely for strategic reasons, but because its very name represented everything he sought to destroy. Across the frozen steppes, Stalin faced his own demons. The German invasion of 1941 had brought the Soviet Union to the brink of collapse. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed, captured, or scattered. The Germans stood at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet industrial capacity had been decimated as factories were hastily relocated eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. By the summer of 1942, Stalin knew that the Soviet Union could not afford another catastrophic retreat. When Hitler's forces turned south toward Stalingrad, Stalin issued Order Number 227, forever known by its chilling phrase, "Not one step back." Retreat without orders would be punished by death. Cowardice would be met with execution. The message was clear. Stalingrad would be held at any cost, or those who failed would pay with their lives. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, approached Stalingrad with confidence, born of 2 years of almost unbroken victory. Paulus was a meticulous officer, a staff planner thrust into field command, leading an army of over 270,000 men supported by tanks, artillery, and the dreaded Luftwaffe. The German soldiers who marched toward the Volga believed the city would fall within weeks, just as so many Soviet cities had fallen before. They had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and driven deep into Russia itself. What could one industrial city do against the might of the Wehrmacht? But Stalingrad was not like other cities. Stretching nearly 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, it was a vital industrial center, home to the Red October Steel Factory, the Barakati Arms Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory that had been converted to produce T-34 tanks. More importantly, it was the gateway to the Caucasus oil fields and the lifeline of the Volga River itself. The city's capture would cut Soviet Russia in two. Stalin understood this. Hitler understood this. And soon, the entire world would understand this. The battle began on August 23, 1942, with a terror from the skies that few had ever witnessed. The Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the entire war, with over 600 aircraft dropping thousands of tons of bombs on the city. The sky turned black with smoke as firestorms erupted across Stalingrad. Wooden buildings disintegrated in the inferno. Oil storage tanks exploded, sending rivers of burning fuel through the streets. Civilians who had not been evacuated ran through the flames, searching desperately for shelter that no longer existed. In a single day, over 40,000 civilians perished. The Volga itself seemed to burn as oil spread across its surface and ignited. The city that had once housed over 400,000 people became a landscape of hell. Yet from this hell emerged something the Germans had not anticipated: resistance that would not break. As German forces pushed into the city's outskirts, they encountered Soviet defenders who fought with a desperation unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. General Vasily Chukov, commander of the 62nd Army defending the city, adopted a brutal strategy: hug the enemy. He ordered his troops to engage the Germans at the closest possible range, sometimes mere meters apart, to neutralize the German advantage in air power and artillery. If Soviet and German soldiers were fighting hand-to-hand in the same building, the Luftwaffe could not bomb without killing their own men. The city became a maze of death. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a killing ground. Every basement became a bunker. The Germans, trained for rapid movement and combined arms warfare, found themselves dragged into a grinding war of attrition where their technological advantages meant nothing. Tanks could not maneuver through mountains of rubble. Aircraft could not distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and dust. Artillery bombardments only created more obstacles and hiding places for Soviet defenders. The battle devolved into what soldiers called Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Soviet soldiers developed tactics born of pure desperation. They infiltrated German positions at night, using the cover of darkness and the maze of ruins to strike and vanish. They turned shattered buildings into fortresses, with snipers positioned in upper floors and machine gunners covering every approach. They held positions until annihilated, knowing that every hour they delayed the German advance gave Soviet reinforcements time to cross the Volga. One of the most famous defenders was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who became a legendary sniper. His personal duel with a German sniper instructor, whether entirely factual or partly propaganda, symbolized the intimate, personal nature of the Stalingrad battle. Death came not from distant artillery, but from a bullet fired by a man you could see, hiding in the building across the street. The struggle for Stalingrad centered on several key locations that became legendary in Soviet military history. Pavlov's house, a 4-story residential building, was defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers, led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, for nearly 2 months against repeated German assaults. The building overlooked a square crucial to German advances, and its defenders turned it into an impregnable fortress, mining approaches, fortifying walls, and creating fields of fire that cut down German infantry. Soviet propaganda later claimed that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had lost conquering all of Paris. While exaggerated, the claim captured a fundamental truth. In Stalingrad, every position demanded a price in blood. As September turned to October and October to November, the German advance slowed to a crawl. Paulus threw division after division into the meat grinder, capturing the city block by block, factory by factory, sometimes room by room. The Red October factory changed hands multiple times, with Soviet workers joining soldiers to defend the machinery they had built. The fighting reached such intensity that soldiers measured territorial gains, not in miles or even yards, but in meters. A successful day might mean capturing a single building. Both sides fed reinforcements into the battle as fast as they could be transported, and both sides saw those reinforcements consumed by the insatiable violence. The Soviet troops who defended Stalingrad were not supermen. They were farmers, factory workers, students, men and women who had been thrust into hell with minimal training and often inadequate weapons. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under constant German fire, packed into boats and ferries that were frequently sunk before reaching the western shore. Those who made it across often survived less than 24 hours. Soviet casualties were staggering, with some divisions losing over 80% of their strength within days of entering the battle. Yet they continued to fight because they had no choice, because commissars with pistols stood behind them, because their homes and families lay behind the German lines, and because something in the human spirit refuses to surrender even when surrender seems rational. While the world watched Stalingrad burn, Stalin and his high command planned something audacious. Throughout October and November, even as German forces pushed ever closer to the Volga, Soviet generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky assembled massive armies north and south of the city. They moved quietly, at night, camouflaging their positions, maintaining radio silence. They gathered over 1 million men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and positioned them to strike. At the weakest points of the German front, the flanks held by Romanian, Italian, and Encons, Hungarian armies that lacked the equipment and motivation of their German allies. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive began. In a snowstorm that grounded the Luftwaffe and reduced visibility to meters, Soviet artillery opened fire on positions held by the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. The bombardment lasted 80 minutes and obliterated defensive positions. Then Soviet tanks and infantry poured through the gaps, crushing resistance and driving deep into the rear areas. The Romanian forces, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking anti-tank guns capable of stopping Soviet T-34 tanks, broke and fled. The following day, November 20th, Soviet forces attacked south of Stalingrad with the same devastating effect. The plan was simple and brilliant. Two massive pincers would meet west of Stalingrad, encircling the entire German Sixth Army. On November 23, 1942, the pincers closed near the town of Kalach-on-the-Don. The German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, found itself trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide. Approximately 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were surrounded, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and hope. General Paulus radioed Hitler for permission to break out, while such an attempt still had a chance of success. Hitler's response was absolute. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Retreat was forbidden. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, promised to supply the encircled army by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily. It was a promise that could not be kept. The Luftwaffe struggled to deliver even 100 tons per day, far below the minimum needed to sustain the trapped army. Winter weather, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire took a devastating toll on German transport aircraft. Hundreds of planes were shot down or crashed. Pilots flew multiple missions per day, exhausted and demoralized, watching their comrades die to deliver supplies that were never enough. Inside the pocket, German soldiers began to starve. December brought a desperate German attempt to rescue the Sixth Army. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein organized a relief force, spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Army, to break through the Soviet encirclement. For 2 weeks, German tanks battled toward Stalingrad, pushing to within 30 miles of the trapped army. Paulus was ordered to prepare for a breakout to link with the relief force, but Hitler refused to authorize the actual breakout, insisting the Sixth Army maintain its positions. The moment passed. Soviet reinforcements arrived and threw back Manstein's forces. The relief attempt collapsed. The Sixth Army was doomed. The final act of the Stalingrad tragedy unfolded through the darkest months of winter. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, equipped for summer campaigning and never properly resupplied with winter clothing, froze in their positions. Rations were cut, then cut again, then reduced to levels that sustained life, but not health. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. Soldiers boiled leather belts and boots to extract any nutritional value. Typhus and dysentery ravaged the starving troops. The wounded received minimal care as medical supplies ran out. Men died not gloriously in combat, but miserably in frozen bunkers, forgotten and alone. Soviet forces tightened the noose, launching attacks that compressed the German pocket steadily smaller. The Germans lost their airfields, forcing the Luftwaffe to resort to supply drops that often missed their targets or fell into Soviet hands. By January 1943, the situation had become hopeless, even to Hitler's most fanatical followers. Yet Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal and sent him a message whose meaning was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or take his own life. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Soviet forces captured Paulus in the basement of a department store that served as his headquarters. He had not committed suicide. He had not led a final suicidal charge. He had simply stopped fighting because continuing the slaughter served no purpose. Over the following days, the remaining pockets of German resistance collapsed. On February 2, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. Of the nearly 290,000 men trapped in the pocket, fewer than 91,000 survived to become prisoners of war. Of those prisoners, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany, the rest dying in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and forced labor. The Battle of Stalingrad had consumed both armies. Soviet casualties exceeded 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. Entire divisions had been annihilated and reformed multiple times. The city itself had been obliterated, reduced to rubble and ash, a monument to human destruction. Yet from this catastrophe emerged a turning point in human history. The myth of German invincibility shattered on the banks of the Volga. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed unstoppable, had been stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. The psychological impact resonated across the world. In Germany, 3 days of national mourning were declared. In occupied territories, resistance movements took heart. In Allied capitals, leaders began to believe that Germany could be defeated. More than the strategic implications, Stalingrad revealed something profound about the human capacity for endurance. Soldiers on both sides fought in conditions that should have broken any army. They endured cold that froze flesh in minutes, hunger that reduced men to skeletons, fear that never relented, and losses that defied comprehension. They fought not because they were heroes, though many performed heroic acts, but because they were humans trapped in a system that demanded everything and offered only death or dishonor as alternatives. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad were not so different from us. They had families they longed to return to, dreams they hoped to fulfill, lives they wanted to live. They were consumed by forces beyond their control, sacrificed to the ambitions of men who viewed them as expendable pieces on a strategic chessboard. The ruins of Stalingrad stand today as Volgograd, rebuilt but forever haunted by the ghosts of 1942 and 1943. Battle that raged there reminds us that war is not an abstract concept debated by politicians and generals, but a concrete horror experienced by individuals who bleed, suffer, and die. It reminds us that ideology and ambition, when elevated above human compassion, create hells on earth that consume the innocent and the guilty alike. And it reminds us that in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost and death surrounds us, the human spirit possesses a resilience that defies understanding, a capacity to endure that transforms ordinary people into legends, and a will to survive that can change the course of history itself, but at a cost so terrible that we must ask ourselves whether any victory is worth the price paid in the frozen ruins on the Volga, where the 20th century learned that empires can crumble and gods can bleed.